Thanks, Mike. It really could have been shorter, but that's okay. If you're hoping I answer the question, what does it mean to be a man? Well, that's going to take a lot longer than the 30 minutes they gave me to speak. So I'm going to try to tackle a different objective, stated here on the program, which is to explore what it means to die to ourselves and to rise to new heights of strength, virtue, and purpose. Now, many years ago, a psychiatrist named Dr. M. Scott Peck addressed that very same topic in a book that was called The Road Less Traveled. The book was a humongous success. In fact, it remained on the New York Times bestseller list longer than any paperback ever. And I think one of the reasons for that success came on the very first page. It's the greatest opening line of a book I've ever seen. It was one sentence. It said this: life is difficult. Period. Now, that's not just an obvious observation on his part. It's really the foundation to his whole book. It's also the way to those new heights promised by today's events. You see, Peck's point, which he demonstrated throughout the whole book, is that we human beings tend to think life is supposed to be easy. Or at least easier than it is. And so we naturally try to avoid the hard stuff. So to take the road less traveled, he says, is to learn through discipline and hard work to confront and solve everyday problems. And he says that's the only path to happiness. Discipline, work, solutions. Now that's an appeal to men. The vigor of that challenge is something we all want to rally around. But there's another way to look at this whole thing. The way of St. Francis de Sales. So you see, for him, traveling a spiritual road to the good life is difficult. But not because of the avoidance mechanisms that psychologists speak about. It's difficult because of a much more manly reason with which we can relate. And that is, we want to be perfect. We want to be saints, whom we assume were perfect. De Sales recognizes this inherently male disposition. You're here because of it. You desire spiritual perfection. You want it. You're trying your hardest to be it. And then you realize it ain't going to happen. Welcome to life and to Lent. You see, my plan today, then, is to offer you a Salesian way by which you can take that less traveled road. And one day, hopefully, reach your eternal destination. The map I'm going to draw for you today comes actually from a different book, not The Road Less Traveled, but a book called Live Today Well, which is nowhere near being a bestseller. Unless you all buy lots of copies. It's my only commercial plug. In fact, let me first say a little word about our sponsor, St. Francis de Sales. You may or may not be familiar with him. We call him the other Francis, compared to that guy from Assisi. He's also known as a gentleman saint, but don't let that fool you. This Francis is a doctor of the church who also wrote a bestseller. He called it The Introduction to the Devout Life. It never made the New York Times bestseller list because there wasn't any New York Times 400 years ago. But his book, in those 400 plus years, has never been out of print. Somebody said, though I have no idea who measures this stuff, that it's at least in the top 10 Christian books of this type of all time. But before his fame as a writer, Francis de Sales actually began his church career as a missionary in the faraway, by that I mean about 30 minutes, in the faraway land of the Chablais, which is just south of the Lake of Geneva. He was born about 30 minutes from there. Mired in the wars of religion, that area had become a Protestant stronghold, where Calvinism ruled both politics and religion. Or as I like to say, the days when they took religion seriously. Because whatever religion the political leaders were in a country, the entire country became that religion. And despite his father's objections, for he feared for his son's life, young Francis de Sales took on the challenge of reviving Catholicism in the entire region. And in a short time, in fact, he converted them all. All right, how he pulled off that feat is a very long tale that I'm not going to get into here, except to say this. He had a certain method for doing this, which was different from every missionary that came before him. It also worked a lot better. And it included 3 essential things. First, he was not afraid to celebrate his faith publicly in religious rituals, like the things we do during Lent. Because in his view, beauty has the power to attract people. Second, despite the times in which people who disagreed about faith saw each other as enemies, literally, to the point of killing each other, not unlike today's world. In that climate, Francis made it a point to dialogue with anyone and everyone. He was never afraid to talk to people. Because despite our differences, love trumps judgment. And lastly, while he was convinced that he was right about what he was saying, aren't we all? Francis de Sales proposed what the Catholic faith believes. He didn't try to impose it on people. Because the truth has its own power to convince. All right, there's much more about this saint that's fascinating, but like I said, I only have 30 minutes. So I'm going to give you just 5 things. I'm going to propose to you now his 5-step plan on how to profit from our faults, as a way that each of us can lift high the cross beginning this Lent. The first 3 steps take us down the road of changing our minds. So here we go. Step 1. There's only 5 of them you should be able to remember. Most importantly, you will know when I'm getting near the end. Step 1. Step 1 challenges us to face the facts. Dr. Peck put it quite bluntly at the beginning of his book. Life is difficult. St. Francis de Sales says it a bit differently in two memorable quotes. First, he writes, "Our imperfections are going to accompany us to the grave. We can't go anywhere without having our feet on the ground." Which is true. But that truth often leads us to get frustrated. The reality of that seems to hold us back from soaring to those new heights advertised in today's event. Still, Francis explains further, we must never be astonished at finding ourselves imperfect, because there is no cure for it. Again, there's no cure. You are not and never will be perfect. Sorry. If on the outside chance you do think you have been cured of your faults, there are plenty of folks out there who will happily deliver you from your delusion. We call them wives. But all of us, every single human being, even men alive in Christ, every single one of us suffers from the fundamental fault of being human. We're not God. Some of us think we'd do a better job if we were. We're not God. Even saints experience this existential fault, but they face it quite squarely, and sometimes differently. Francis de Sales once wrote this to his holy friend, St. Jane de Chantal. He said, "I don't know how I'm made. I feel miserable, but I don't trouble myself about it. And sometimes I'm even happy in thinking that on account of all my faults, I'm a really good object for the mercy of God." So, admitting our inability to be perfect is good. Despairing about it is not. Of course, none of us likes to fail or wants to. But our typical responses to that reality, which is usually either to give up or, as men are wont to do, try harder, those things don't change the fact that earthly perfection eludes us. So rather than getting frustrated at our failings, whatever they be, Francis de Sales repeatedly counsels calmness amid the calamities of life. He writes it this way: when we discover that the lute, violin, you probably call it nowadays, when we discover that the lute is out of tune, it's not necessary to break its strings and throw it out. What we have to do is to lend an attentive ear to discover which string is out of tune, and then tighten it or loosen it, whichever is required. Now that's a very different outlook from what our contemporary world thinks, where we champion the value of, self-esteem and take easy comfort in the supposed truth that I'm okay and you're okay. It's a famous book from decades ago. But that's not our way It's neither Christian nor manly. So rest assured, I promise you, you will not be getting any participation trophies today. Don't get me started on that. Our way, especially during Lent, entails focusing on our faults, our weaknesses. It's what the promo for today's event means by confronting your lower nature and embracing the call to true masculinity. But I don't think that the power to change ourselves is sheerly a matter of willpower, that we need to force ourselves to be better. To bring about real change, we need to do as DeSales advises and show, in his words, more compassion for our heart than passion against it. More compassion for our hearts than passion against it. Why? Because as the saint says, this makes the potential for changing sink far deeper and penetrate more effectively than fretful, angry, stormy repentance. By the way, if you're a coach or a parent of a young athlete, please remember that the next time you decide to yell at somebody during a game. It doesn't work. It doesn't help. I used to coach soccer in high school, freshman soccer, with one of the best high school coaches in the city of Philadelphia, Tom Smith. Legendary coach in Philadelphia. If you ever watch him coach a game, he did this. For 90 minutes. Never said a word. I said to him, Smitty, how can you just stand there and not? He says, first of all, they can't hear you. Second of all, they can't pay attention during a game. Just yell at them in practice if you want, but smart man. All right. On to step number 2, which invites us to shift the balance of power. You see, we change our mind for the better when we learn to focus not on our own ineptitude, but on the eternal power of God. After all, no matter how prevalent our misdeeds are, nothing that we do or fail to do changes who God is. The foundation of our trust, writes Francis de Sales, should be in Him, not in us. All the more so because we change and God never does. He always remains good and merciful, whether we are weak and imperfect, or we are strong and perfect. And that, my friends, is the difference between optimism and hope. Because optimism is just an outlook on life. Hope comes from conviction about God. Convinced of what we believe, we entrust ourselves to the divine power. That's what gives us the best chance to advance along the path to perfection, because God alone has the power to redeem. One of Francis de Sales' spiritual daughters, a nun named Mary de Sales Chapuis, said it best centuries later. She said, each time we offer him a fault to be forgiven, we offer Jesus the title of Savior. All right, that brings me to step number 3, which is start over. Again and again and again. Because taking the steps to overcome our faults and live a holy life is a never-ending task. That's why we do Lent every year. It's the same thing every year. Sure. But renewing our efforts despite repeated failures is not a sign of desperation, but of persistence. Now, some may think that starting over despite never seeming to arrive at our goal comes from being thick-headed. Remember those wives? But it really comes from being hopeful and faithful. After all, even Jesus himself fell 3 times. And so St. Francis de Sales always gives the advice to start over again each new day. Because we start over from a different place than where we were. Today is not yesterday. Tomorrow's not going to be today. Each new day is just that. New. It's a chance to start over. But we're a little closer, especially in time. We're a day closer to heaven, hopefully. Every single day starts over. But it's new. That's it in terms of changing your minds. Embrace your imperfection, trust in God, and persist every day in trying to better yourself. But to truly profit from our faults, there are still 2 more steps, short ones, that take us down the road of changing our everyday routine. First, we change how we think about things. Then we change how we do things. So step 4, I'm almost there. Step 4 happens at the beginning of every new day, when we prepare for the inevitable. Right? So each morning, you probably make a mental checklist of what lies ahead of you. Right? People to see, things to do, places to go. We kind of think ahead of time of what's coming this day. You thought to yourself, gotta go to this men's thing. Later you'll say, so glad I was there. Or, I could have gotten a lot of other stuff done. We prepare. Well, Francis de Sales says, take this very normal habit, but do it differently. Ponder the day more spiritually than just practically. In other words, take all of those things we have to do and people we have to see and places we have to go and think of them in terms of the supernatural. Challenges, opportunities to be who we're supposed to be. Some of what we face during the day is foreseeable. Other things will come as a surprise. But in both of those cases, there will be moments each day that challenge us with a temptation to let our faults run free. In my line of work, those opportunities are called meetings and committees. Thank God when he decided to save the world, he didn't send a committee. Anyway. fact, I totally agree with a Facebook post I recently saw that said, most meetings should be emails. And most emails should be beers. In any case, whatever you foresee as potentially troublesome for you this day, choose ahead of time to make the most of it. It's going to happen anyhow, so prepare for it. Do that by looking for ways to practice virtue, the virtue contrary to your faults. So for instance, if someone you have to see irritates you or annoys you, plan ahead to greet them nicely. At the very least, it will confuse them. If somewhere you have to be is going to be uncomfortable or unwelcome, plan ahead ways that you can make it more peaceable. If something you have to do is difficult or even out of your control, like listening to a bunch of speakers, plan ahead to try to be patient. You see, the genius to this, what we call the preparation of the day, is that if we can confront the challenge ahead of us beforehand, and if we ready ourselves to act virtually, despite those near occasions of sin, we are much more likely to do the good that we want to do rather than fail because of our faults. I know it's coming. Prepare it goodly, and we're more likely to be good. And then the saint says, when your plan for the day is complete, offer all of it to God and ask for the grace to live today well. Just today. See, this is one of the things I've learned about the spiritual life. We all want to live a really good, holy life. We all want to become saints. And we think that entails the entirety of our lives, which is way too much. When I think about trying to be holy my whole life, that's way too much work. I can't imagine it, especially given the past. Francis de Sales was brilliant. He said, don't think that way. Live today well. Just try being a saint today. When tomorrow comes, you can try again. I can manage a day, more or less. A whole season, a whole year, a whole lifetime? That's big. It's too big. Just live today well. It's got enough challenges. And then at the end of the day comes step number 5, which is to examine your conscience. A practice we're all familiar with, but again, a different take on this. To ask how was your day is not just a question asked by wives or friends. We should ask that of ourselves every night. But again, Francis de Sales insists that we do this, review our day, differently, from a spiritual point of view, which thereby is the mirror to preparing the day in the morning. How did your plan to be virtuous work out? Where did your faults come back to haunt you? But here's the difference. Whatever you find in your examination of the day, you should give thanks for. Yes, not just the good stuff, which we tend not even to examine, But both the virtues you practiced and the vices by which you failed, be thankful for. It's brilliant psychology. In fact, nowadays there's a movement called positive psychology that actually has the brain research to prove the point Francis de Sales made 400 and some years ago. They say that if each day you give thanks for something very specific, not just thank you for a good day, but something very specific, 3 things every day for 3 weeks, it changes your brain, literally. Why? Because if I have to spend the day coming up with 3 things to be thankful for, I'm going to start looking for them. When I look to give thanks, that changes us. So he says, give thanks for both the virtues and the vices. The good things I did, and the not so good things. Because the virtues are an expression of God's grace and inspiration. And the vices, the faults, the weaknesses, the failures, well, at the end of the day, there's something you survived. And now something you need still to work on. And start again tomorrow. And before you doze off each night, he recommends that we commend ourselves to God. Into your hands, O Lord, I deliver up my spirit. Because ultimately, that's the bottom line. For God's love and mercy are still and always will be there for you. So there you have it. It's a rather simple plan. First, change your mind to see that the need for conversion is not a criticism of you, but it's evidence that you aspire to heaven. And when heaven is the goal of our life's journey, then our faults can profit us by showing us where and how we need God's grace. Then, cooperating with that grace, change your daily routine to prepare for and examine the progress you make each single day, one day at a time. In fact, he says it this way: let us be firmly resolved to serve God with our whole heart and life. Beyond that, let's not have any cares about tomorrow. Let us think only of living today well. When tomorrow comes, it will be today, and we can worry about it then. It's a good way to think. But let me conclude with this caveat. As genius as an approach that Francis de Sales gives to us, as practical as it is in terms of preparing our day, examining at night, giving thanks for both, and just taking one day at a time, let me tell you, this Salesian plan is not as easy as it sounds. Dr. Peck was right. Life is difficult. But St. Francis de Sales was righter. For he gives us a way to profit from our faults while reminding us that rest is reserved for heaven, he said. While on earth, we should always fight as though we are between fear and hope. But we must do so knowing, being convinced that hope will always always be stronger. Because we bear in mind the power of the one who comes to our aid. The one who died on the cross, that we might live forever. As you continue to figure out what it means to be a Christian man, may God come to your aid, especially this Lent, so that you may profit from your faults and become the men God calls you all to be. May God be blessed.